Hello, my name is Dr. Jeffrey Nicholas. I have a doctorate in philosophy. This is a lecture on moral argumentation. In this lecture, I'll go over the basics of argument and specifically what it takes to make a moral argument and some steps for evaluating a moral argument. This is an introductory lecture. So when we talk about arguments, we can define them as a series of statements, some of which the premises rationally support, another of which the conclusion. So we're not talking about the kinds of arguments that we might see in politics today or even in families where people are just yelling at each other or they're just making one claim and then another claim. We're talking about building a case with reasons to support a conclusion. So an example here from time immemorial, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Another example, all persons should have the right to make their own choices. Women are persons, therefore women should have their rights to make choices. So just take a second there, pause the screen, and ask yourself, what is the conclusion here and what are the premises? Presumably what you have picked out is that the conclusion for the first argument is this: Socrates is mortal. That's what the person is trying to convince you of. And his premises are all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. For the second argument, the conclusion is women should have their rights to make choices, and the premises are all persons should have the right to make their own choices, and women are persons. And so this person is trying to convince you that women should have rights. You can see here that the therefore states or notifies or gives evidence that this is a conclusion here, signifies that this is a conclusion. Obviously, arguments are not often written this way, so the conclusion can come first with the reasons after. Oftentimes there is not a therefore to show that. Sometimes there are other words. You might have because or since, which indicates the premises. So I encourage you to look online for indicator words for arguments that will help you identify the premises and conclusions of an argument. Now, when we talk about arguments, we're talking about statements that are conclusions and premises. So what is a statement? It's simply a claim or an assertion that something is or is not true. So a statement is something that can be true or false. Obviously, questions are neither true nor false, generally speaking. They might have a true answer or a false answer, but questions themselves are not claims of this type, which is true or false. So examples of statements are: the chemical makeup of water is 2 parts hydrogen atoms and 1 part oxygen atom. The earth is round. Most likely an alien civilization exists in another galaxy. The government knows who killed Tupac. Women and men are equal. There is a 98% likelihood that a person in this room is female. Denying a woman the right to a midwife at birth is morally wrong. So you can see that these are different kinds of claims. This is a scientific claim. This is an observational claim. Here we have a probability claim, so it says most likely. Here again, the government knows who killed Tupac. Women and men are equal. This becomes a moral claim. So when we talk about different kinds of claims, we want to make sure that we know what kind of claims we're talking about. Is it something that I can observe, like the size of a room or the chemical makeup of water? Or is it something that we have to engage theory in to understand what the moral claim that's being made? Now, typically we talk about 2 different argument types, deductive and inductive, and I'm going to go over these briefly. So a deductive argument has necessity, whereas an inductive argument has probability. When I talk about necessity and probability here, I don't want you to understand this as saying that you believe the argument is necessarily true or you believe that the argument is probable. What I'm asking you to think about is, what do the premises and conclusion, what is the relationship between these things? So in a deductive argument, the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is a necessary one. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So the example here is that producing children through IVF commodifies them. Commodification treats people as things. One should never treat a human child as a thing. Therefore, IVF is immoral. Hopefully you can see that if these premises are true, then this conclusion must be true as well. Now notice that this is a moral argument. So we have several claims here, one of which is a moral claim. One should never treat a human child as a thing. And then these two, this one is obviously a statement of fact. And then this one also becomes a moral claim as well. Okay. So in order to have a conclusion that is a moral claim, right, that you're saying something is right or wrong, at least one of the premises must be a moral claim. And of course, one of them presumably is going to be a statement of fact. This is necessary. These premises cannot be true, and the conclusion is false. In an inductive argument, the premises can be true and the conclusion false. And so what we're looking for is a very strong likelihood that these premises mean that this is true. So here we have the argument, most surrogates are poor while people using surrogates are rich. Poverty often compromises a person's autonomy. We should do whatever we can to protect autonomy. Therefore, we should prevent surrogacy. Notice here this says most. So we're already dealing with something that's probable or something that does not cover every necessary case, right? So you want to look for those kinds of words, right? Here we have often, same thing. Poverty often compromises a person's autonomy. Doesn't mean it does every time, doesn't mean it's necessary, but often it does. And so therefore we should do whatever we can to protect autonomy. That is a moral claim. It's a statement that is not probable. It's a statement of what we should do in every case. And then the conclusion says we should prevent surrogacy. Now this conclusion is stated with the same kind of universality that this claim is made with. But here we see that these have some probability to them. So we might pick at this argument to see how much probability we have. Is most surrogates, does that mean 51% or does it mean 99%? The idea here, though, is that a deductive argument, the premises, if they are true, means that the conclusion is true. Probability, if the premises are true, the conclusion still might be true, and so what we're looking for is higher probability. Again, this has nothing to do with your intentions or what you believe. It has to do with how we frame the relationship between the premises and the conclusions. Now, deductive arguments can be described as valid and sound. If you have an inductive argument, you would not use the term valid. This is a common mistake in everyday parlance. It is a mistake that you ought not to commit in this class. Okay? So a valid argument is one where there are no fallacies and no logical mistakes. Okay? So it means that the form of the argument is valid, that if the premises are true, then the conclusion will be. So it points out a particular form, and I encourage you to look at your textbook to look at more discussion of valid and the kinds of forms that they discusses there. So all surrogacy requires the sacrifice of baby elves. All killing of baby elves violates the principle of non-maleficence and thus is immoral. Therefore, all surrogacy violates the principle of non-maleficence and thus is immoral. Now, this is a valid argument even if the premises are not true. So surrogacy, as far as I know, does not require the sacrifice of baby elves. So you want to keep that in mind. A sound argument is a valid argument with true premises. So this would be a valid argument but not sound. This presumably is going to be a valid argument that is sound, and so the premises are, at least I believe they are, true. All persons have a right to choose medical procedures. All choice requires understanding. All people with severe mental incapacity lack understanding. Algernon has severe mental incapacity. Therefore, Dr. Phil's operation on Algernon violates his right to choose. Sorry, I went ahead of myself there. Notice that there's a missing premise here, so you always have to be careful about that. So here we're talking about Dr. Phil operating. That's not mentioned in these premises, so we have to include a statement there about that. So you also have to look out in your arguments for missing premises as well. Most of the arguments that you're going to be dealing with, though, are inductive. Okay, inductive arguments can be strong or weak, and they can be cogent or incogent. So a strong argument means that there is greater probability, right? Dangerous medical situations should be overseen by medical professionals. All pregnancies can become dangerous, therefore all pregnancies should be overseen by medical professionals. Here it says can become, so there's a probability here. Maybe it won't become, but it can become. And then the issue is whether the all is true or not, okay? Most research on pregnancy will tell you that all pregnancies, unless there are extenuating circumstances, do not become dangerous. So this is intended to be a strong argument, but one of the premises we believe is not true. And we'll discuss this more later in the semester. Cogent versus incogent, a strong argument with true premises. So 90% of women can deliver safely without medical intervention or doctors. Very short for it should be legal for most women to deliver by midwife rather than obstetrician. Here we have a high probability, 90%, so it's a strong argument. And we also know that this statement is true from research that we've done. So this is going to be a true premise with a strong argument is going to be cogent. If the premises were untrue, then the argument would be incogent. Now, I've already talked about normative moral arguments. So this is an argument in which there's the conclusion is trying to make a moral claim, so asserting that an action is right or wrong, or that a person or motive is good or bad. In a normative argument, as I've already stated, at least one of the premises must address the normative realm. Now, I want to criticize this approach. This is the approach that's used in your book, but I want you to be a little open to criticizing this. So when we call something moral, we're automatically presuming that there's a distinction between morality and the facts of human life. And that is not true for a variety of moral theories, particularly virtue theory. And Aristotle is a primary representative of virtue theory. So flourishing, which is the key idea of Aristotle's moral theory, is an objective condition. We can tell when someone is flourishing or not. And natural law also relies on facts, and so here we would not say that moral statements are separate from the facts of life. Thomas Aquinas would be a prime proponent of the natural law theory. However, we also want to point out that allowing the possibility for saying that other aspects of life or society are more important than morality is an issue here. If we say this is a moral issue, then many people in the corporate boardroom will simply ignore it. They're only interested in the legal issues. And I encourage you to watch the video on legal and religious claims versus moral claims and think about what's more important there. And then the other question is, what really is morality? And that's a difficult question. Hopefully we'll come to some understanding of that over the course of this semester. But really, when we talk about something being moral, we need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're really pointing out there? What is it to say that one statement is a moral statement? So in the first part of this presentation, I've used these colloquially, and what I'm doing here is asking you to think about the colloquial use of these terms. Now, obviously, most of our work is going to be evaluating moral arguments, and that means evaluating moral premises. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, a moral premise might get support from a different premise. So other premises might support the primary premise of your moral theory. Your moral argument. A moral theory itself might support it. So virtue theory might support the premise that you're working at. And then we have our own reliable moral judgments. We all know that it's simply wrong to torture puppies and babies. And then we also might question moral premises. So do they conflict with other premises, theories, and judgments that we might have? So when you look at a moral argument, ask these kinds of questions. Finally, when you're evaluating a moral argument, you want to take these 4 steps. Check the truth of the non-moral and moral premises, right? What's the probability? What is the likelihood that this is a true premise? Check the connection between the premises and the conclusion. Is it a solid connection? Is it deductive or inductive? Most likely it's going to be inductive. Check for fallacies or other logical errors, and I encourage you to look at your text to find out fallacies. And then check for circumstantial issues. Does the argument say its moral principle only applies in this or that situation?